The Wild West was full of shootouts, ambushes, and men who seemed too tough to die. But here's the real twist. Some of its most legendary figures met their end in ways you'd never believe. Let's look at the 8 most tragic deaths of Wild West legends. 8. Bat Masterson, the gunslinger who died quietly at his desk. You'd expect a man like Bat Masterson to go out in a blaze of gunfire, or maybe at high noon on a dusty street. After all, he spent his youth trading bullets in Dodge City, shoulder to shoulder with Wyatt Earp, taming one of the rowdiest towns in America. He'd seen friends gunned down, watched his own brother die in a shootout, and carried more scars than he cared to count. And yet, for all the danger he faced, the end didn't come from a bullet. By his late 40s, Bat had grown tired of the frontier chaos. The Old West was fading anyway, swallowed up by railroads, telegraphs, and cities. So he traded his 6-shooter for a typewriter, moved east, and reinvented himself as a sports writer in New York City. On October 25, 1921, Bat was at his desk, typing out a column just like any other day. In mid-sentence, he slumped forward. A heart attack had claimed him at 67 years old. Think about that. A man who'd faced down killers, lived through ambushes, and tamed lawless towns, taken not by gunpowder, but by his own heart, in the calm of a newsroom. And if Bat's end feels surprisingly quiet, just wait, because the next legend's death wasn't just tragic, it was hauntingly poetic. 7. Annie Oakley, a love story that ended in tragedy. Most Wild West stories are dripping with grit, betrayal, or blood. But Annie Oakley's is different. Hers is less about gunsmoke and more about a love story that somehow feels both tender and tragic. Annie wasn't just good with a rifle, she was extraordinary. As a teenager, she entered a shooting contest against a seasoned marksman named Frank Butler. Out of 25 birds, Frank hit 24. Annie hit all 25. Frank may have lost the match, but he gained something else, a lifelong partner. The two married and spent nearly 5 decades together, touring the world with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Audiences marveled as Annie could shoot a cigarette out of Frank's mouth or split a playing card in half midair. But behind the spectacle was a marriage built on trust and mutual respect, rare in the rough and tumble West. In her later years, Annie's health declined. In 1926, she passed away from anemia. Less than 3 weeks later, Frank followed. Some said it was grief that killed him, the weight of living without her simply too heavy to bear. They were laid to rest side by side, closing a chapter not with violence, but with devotion, a love story sealed in the soil. But if Annie's end tugs at the heart, Buffalo Bill Cody's death is one tangled in mystery, myth, and conspiracy. 6. Buffalo Bill Cody, a showman's death shrouded in mystery. When you hear the name Buffalo Bill, you probably picture a larger-than-life showman, complete with buckskins and a cavalry of trick riders. And that's fair. William F. Cody basically invented the mythology of the Wild West with his famous traveling show. But his own final act? It was stranger than fiction. Buffalo Bill died in 1917 from kidney failure while staying with his sister in Denver. But here's where things get unusual. His will stated he wanted to be buried atop Lookout Mountain in Colorado, a place with sweeping views. Problem was, it was January, the mountain roads were buried under snow, and the funeral procession couldn't make it up. So what did they do? They embalmed him. Not once, not twice, but 6 times over the next 6 months, keeping his body preserved until the thaw. By the time he was finally buried, Cody had spent half a year in cold storage. Then came the controversy. Some insisted Buffalo Bill belonged in Cody, Wyoming, the very town he founded. Rumors swirled that his body was secretly stolen and reburied there, leaving conspiracy theorists debating his true resting place to this very day. It's almost fitting. The greatest showman of the Old West, leaving behind one final mystery. And if you think that's wild, Calamity Jane's story takes irony to an entirely new level. 5. Calamity Jane, the hard life that finally broke her. If Buffalo Bill was the polished performer, Calamity Jane was the rough edge of the frontier. A woman who never quite fit into polite society. She carved out her survival by riding hard, shooting straight, and drinking harder than most men she met. Jane worked odd jobs, sometimes dressing as a man just to be taken seriously. She joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show for a time, entertaining audiences with her sharp aim and wild reputation. But her fame wasn't built just on skill. It was built on her larger-than-life personality. She was brash, bold, and often drunk. That last part, though, caught up with her. Years of heavy drinking left her body wrecked, and by 1903, pneumonia finally pushed her over the edge. She was only 51. Here's where the irony bites. She was buried next to Wild Bill Hickok, a man she adored and often claimed as her companion. The problem? Hickok never returned those feelings. In fact, some say he found her more nuisance than partner. Locals believed burying her beside him was either a cruel joke or a twisted nod to her unrequited love. So while Jane's legend lives on as the hard-drinking, sharpshooting woman of the frontier, her death reminds us that even the toughest spirits can be undone. And speaking of tragic irony, Belle Starr, the so-called Bandit Queen, would soon meet a death as mysterious as the life she led. 4. Belle Starr, murdered by her own circle. They called her the Bandit Queen, though truth be told, Belle Starr was more infamous for the company she kept than for her own crimes. She mingled with outlaws, rode beside desperados, and twice married men who both ended up dead in gunfights. By reputation alone, she became a figure draped in mystery and menace. But reputation has a price. In 1889, while riding home on horseback, Belle was ambushed. 2 bullets struck her in the back, throwing her from her saddle. She died right there in the dirt. A legend felled not by lawmen, but by betrayal. The killer was never named. Some whispered it was a bitter neighbor settling a score. Others pointed to rivals in her own outlaw circle. The darkest rumor of all claimed her own son pulled the trigger. To this day, no one knows for certain. And that's the cruel irony. The woman who thrived in the shadows of the Wild West didn't get a clean duel or dramatic standoff. Instead, her life ended in suspicion and whispers, proving that in the outlaw world, danger often came from those closest to you. And while Belle's death was clouded in mystery, Billy the Kid's was tangled in something else entirely: doubt. 3. Billy the Kid, a shadowy death and endless doubt. Billy the Kid was more myth than man even in his own lifetime. By 21, he'd carved out a reputation with 17 killings, countless jailbreaks, and a charisma that made him both feared and admired. Lawmen chased him, newspapers immortalized him, and legends bloomed with every story told around a campfire. But in 1881, the law finally caught up. Sheriff Pat Garrett arrested Billy and hauled him in for trial. He was convicted and sentenced to hang. That should have been the end. Except Billy wasn't finished. In a daring escape, he shot 2 deputies dead and vanished back into the New Mexico scrub. Garrett hunted him relentlessly, tracking whispers and rumors for months. Then one July night, he crept into a darkened bedroom at the Maxwell Ranch. When Billy walked in, unarmed, Garrett fired a single shot. The outlaw fell dead, or at least, that's the official story. The problem is, legends don't die so neatly. Years later, imposters came forward claiming to be Billy, each spinning their own tale of survival. Some swore the kid lived on under another name, hiding in plain sight. None of it was ever proven, but it didn't have to be. The myth of Billy the Kid had already outlived the man. And if Billy's end blurred the line between fact and folklore, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid took that same blur to an international stage. 2. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, a final shootout in the Andes. Few outlaws captured the imagination quite like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. With their gang, the Wild Bunch, they robbed banks and trains with a kind of precision that made them nearly untouchable. For years, lawmen were left chasing shadows while Cassidy planned one flawless getaway after another. But even legends run out of road. By the early 1900s, the pair had fled to South America, trying to settle into quiet lives. That peace didn't last. When a payroll shipment in Bolivia tempted them back into crime, their old habits caught up. In 1908, Bolivian cavalry surrounded the house where they were holed up. A fierce shootout erupted, bullets shredding the night air. When the guns fell silent, 2 bodies were found inside. Sundance was shot clean between the eyes. Cassidy, it seemed, had turned the gun on himself rather than be captured. That should have been the end. But like Billy the Kid, their story refused to stay buried. Sightings of Cassidy popped up for years, in Wyoming, in Utah, even in South America. Some swore he'd made it out alive, trading gun smoke for anonymity. Maybe the shootout was the final act, or maybe it wasn't. Either way, their legend endured because the Wild West wasn't ready to let them go. And speaking of legends betrayed by their own, the end of Jesse James was perhaps the cruelest twist of all. 1. Jesse James, betrayed in his own home. Jesse James was no ordinary outlaw. To many, he was a folk hero, a rebel standing against authority, his robberies woven into stories of daring and defiance. But behind the legend was a man increasingly trapped by his own notoriety. By 1882, Missouri's governor had placed a $10,000 reward on Jesse's head, a fortune at the time. Distrust began to spread through his gang. And that's when Bob and Charlie Ford stepped forward with a plan of their own. They struck a deal with the governor, the bounty, and a pardon, if they delivered Jesse dead. On April 3rd, Jesse James was at home, seemingly relaxed. He took off his guns, walked over to adjust a picture hanging on the wall, and in that quiet, ordinary moment, Bob Ford raised his pistol. One shot to the back of the head ended the life of the West's most famous outlaw. Jesse James died not in a shootout, not hunted down in the open, but betrayed in his own living room by men he considered allies. It was the ultimate irony. The most dangerous man in the West brought down not by lawmen or soldiers, but by treachery at his back. And in that single moment, the Wild West proved a truth that echoed through every legend we've covered. In a world built on loyalty, guns, and survival, betrayal was always the deadliest weapon of all.